The next day, John was there again with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. Over the past 2 to 3 years, I have found my head turned and my heart caught by the transformative glimpse of God I have experienced through Christian community. Like the 2 disciples, I have felt this glimpse feed a deeper curiosity, prompting me to follow and ultimately be invited to come and see. To this end, this 2023, I am embarking on a 6-month journey to dwell with various Christian communities. On the way, I'll be sharing interviews with community members, founders, and leaders to learn more about the blessings, challenges, and wisdom these dwelling places of God hold. In doing so, I hope to inform how it is we might nurture people and communities to be transformative manifestations of God, offering a glimpse of the divine and inviting people to come and see God's loving dwelling place.
My name is Mobsby, so I'm currently the prior to the Blackfriars Community here in South London. And I'm also part of the chapter of what's called the Society of the Holy Trinity, which is an umbrella, more missionally focused initiative and acknowledged religious community of the Church of England, promoting new monasticism in particular. My journey, I would want to take it right back to when I was what I now understand as being spiritual but not religious and very unchurched and absolutely not Christian, to having a combination of going to the Taizé community, dragged there by my friends in my late teens, and then later going to university in York and experiencing some very early, what has been called fresh expressions of church around community and Christian spirituality. So that whole side of, contemplative prayer, that whole more mystical, contemplative has always been very important to me. Plus, becoming a Christian was a bit of a shock to all my family, let alone later getting ordained. So my route was because I'm getting old now, there was something called the alternative worship movement that became the emerging church. And from that, I think I became really interested in this idea of new monasticism, which is again looking at the inheritance of Christian monasticism reframed within the context of the now. Partly, I think, was because I was bored of dumbed down Christianity, where it was all in your head and not in your heart, and all words and no do. So I was like a real hunger for what I experienced at Taizé, which was quite profound. How could that be thought through for Christians living in a particular place? So that's it. So my background was involved in forming the Moot community, which was the first really fresh expressions, new monastic Anglican thing. When it was a big thing in the City of London. That took 16 years of my life, making that work. And then after that, I went to Peckham in the North Peckham estate, which is a really difficult place with more of a small residential, bordering on Franciscan sort of community. And I've been here for 4 years now, south of Blackfriars Bridge, which was again about planting and the last 2 jobs have been planting new monastic communities in failing parish churches, with a sense of trying to promote depth and some depth of spirituality to revive a sense of parish.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so in a minute, I'm going to ask you more questions about the Blackfriars community, but before going there, I'm interested in the what did you say, the Society of
the Holy Trinity?
And you said kind of
it's an umbrella thing. So it's an acknowledged religious community in the Church of England, and so there's a difference. So acknowledged and recognise. Recognise are your traditional communities, the Benedictine, Franciscan, largely, and Oxford Movement others. The acknowledged are those that have a rhythm of life where people don't make first order vows. Yeah, so they have a rhythm of life and meet certain expectations. And the last couple of years, because of some of the abuse in the church, there is now a canon for the religious life in the Church of England, so that all acknowledged and recognised communities come under proper governance structures within the church, which is a good thing. It's a good thing.
So I keep forgetting the name, Society of...
The Holy Trinity.
Society of the Holy Trinity.
Yeah.
Is that a dispersed community then? How is it? Yes, is it a community? Do you kind of pray on Zoom with them, or how many of you are there?
So originally it was set up because there was a real awareness that lots of little communities got going and they burnt out really quickly, either because of the weight of church or resistance, or just actually how difficult it is to do Christian community in the way that we're talking, whether in either residential or dispersed. So the idea of the Society of the Trinity was to try and be an umbrella fraternity, really, to try and support and encourage little missional startups of new monasticism, most of them within a parish context, some not in any particular church context. And that is now, that meets up quite regularly on Zoom. There is a plan to try and meet up residentially with everybody. And there, at the moment, I think there's about 4 or 5 communities that have been birthed and exist, and there's about 5 to 10 pioneers trying to set them up, and they are largely in England, Scotland, Wales, and Canada at the moment.
That's fascinating. I don't know why I haven't heard about this before, sooner.
It's a small thing.
And how does the community support these kind of new monastic pioneering?
Well, there's a central rhythm of life to it. There's a shared governance, and there's a sense of people called to a particular way of life as Christians, ordinary Christians, where they don't want to live in it, they don't feel called to go to first order vows or communities. So how do you live in the world with this sort of frame around a rhythm of life and a focus on prayer and action? So I think so there's a sense of calling to that particular way of being Christian. And secondly, it has to be contextualised. So all of these little communities, so there's one in London, there's one in Ipswich, there's one, my brain has just died. Where's the others? They're spread all over the place, but they're all very different because the context is very different. Yeah, but they've still got the same rhythm. A bit like if you go and look at a Franciscan community, like Anglican Franciscans all over the place, they're all very different, not because the context is very different. So in that way, that's what the Society of the Trinity, and it's try and encourage things not to get lost and burnt out, so they actually come to maturity. And it's not easy, these sort of communities. There's normally a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning and then a burnout, or people move on very quickly. So in my own community, in the Moot community, that was trying to reach out to unchurched people who were struggling with mental illness and addiction and well-being issue, because there was a huge suicide risk all around where we were. So it did do that really well, but bizarrely turned out 14 people became ordained as a result of their involvement in Moot, which is huge. So it almost turned into a vicar factory, which hasn't happened here, which interestingly, but with the Moot that definitely did for a while. So quite a lot of pioneers spread out across England now had some sort of involvement with the Moot community.
Wow, and I'd love to probe more into the challenges of pioneering and sustainability. But maybe we could talk about the Blackfriars community first, and that will kind of lead us on. So do you mind describing the Blackfriars community? Yeah.
So when I first came here, it's true to say that I think that the rector that was before me possibly didn't have the skills to be able to attend to the missional focus. And I think there was a lot of hurt, a lot of disappointment, a lot of difficulty. So it was literally on its knees and nearly dead. So I'm very committed to the whole fresh expressions process, which starts with listening to context before you do anything, and not just doing worship services thinking that attracts everybody, which is sometimes the default position, which drives me crazy. But anyway, so we listened to context a lot, and what we heard loud and clear that in this area south of Blackfriars Bridge in North Southwark, there's a deep sense of disconnection there was a lot of fragmentation. The area didn't really have any sense of identity. It was between Waterloo and Borough Market. And the sense that there was huge issues with stress, well-being, addiction. You know, we're hearing that loud and clear from people working in the area at the time. Those, you know, super rich moving into the area as well, with what some people sometimes call affluenza, which I like quite a lot. And then two quite significant social estates where people were struggling before the pandemic, let alone now with the cost of living crisis as well. So we heard loud and clear a real need for thinking about well-being. And then because of some research I was just doing, PhD research, there's also a big connection, I think, with what people would call spiritual but not religious, or unchurched spiritual seekers, and the realisation that lots of people were exploring what I would want to call post-secular spirituality. So then there was a place then, or how can we open up Christian spirituality to lots of spiritual seekers, thinking that Christianity had no resources for this sort of thing. So drawing on some experiences with the Moot community, we started to run meditation groups, which we've called Meditation for Busy People, which is about people whose real motivation is around well-being. But then we attracted quite a lot of people who were really interested, who had a mixture of de-churched and unchurched people, who were really interested in a rhythm of life focused on prayer and prayer practices and community, of the heart, you know, a real orientation of the heart, rather than more heady stuff, which is what the church seems to be full of. So we opened up a sense of, right, so we started off with, because it was in the middle of the pandemic, when we got going with this, and it started with a conversation talking about new monasticism, and that grew into people saying, no, we're going to start a community to live, a worship, mission and community. So, yeah, there was only Sunday morning services here, once a month when I first came here. And now there's daily offices which are sustained by the community, and an evening service and a Sunday morning congregation every week. So that's birthed new life. So it's kind of a mixed ecology parish where some of the revitalisation is happening by the new monastic community's presence in this context, because I think it just helps frame that depth. And so it's really lovely that we've got lots of unchurched people who feel part of that community, who are exploring Christianity possibly for the first time, alongside de-churched people who've left the church because they couldn't bear it and then are coming back to it, plus those who feel really called to live this at their heart. And it's a very, it takes years, this type of work. It's fragile, it's new, it's small, but there's something really beautiful about it that, so me being quite a mission-minded Anglican priest, for me, I love new monasticism when it really comes together, because it's deeply transformative, not only for the people seeking to reach, but also ourselves.
Yeah. Wow. And so for the Blackfriars community, it's a dispersed community, but everyone lives more or less locally.
Well, it's quite spread out. So some people travel from outside London. The majority of people live in London, but London, the way it is now, it doesn't really work like a normal city, because it's so super expensive to live anywhere now. So it's almost like a network society in itself. So we've almost got like a network new monastic community in the context of a network city, where those who are not the super rich have to live outside of London majoritively.
And so people, so you have nearly daily rhythms of prayer?
There's only Monday and Friday where there's not prayer.
And people come and participate in those services, which are quite drawing on various Christian traditions.
That's it. And they're hybrid as well, so it is possible that you can be involved in it through a streamed thing, which is not the same. But we do one deliberately online Compline on Thursday nights, which is only online, and that reaches people around the world, which is quite interesting, through Zoom. But yes, so mostly people come here at least twice a week, for those who live locally more. Yeah.
And some communities have a bit of a kind of a commissioning process at the beginning of the year, being we've taken these promises to this way of life for a year, 3 years, whatever it is for that community. Is that how it works here, or do people just trickle in and trickle out?
Well, there's a bit of trickling in, trickling out, but there is a, for people who are serious to the community that really want to somehow commit to it, there is a rhythm of live service that we do, should be once a year. And normally with a bishop of some description, or at least an archdeacon, to receive people's seasonal vows. And that's in keeping with the Society of the Trinity, because there's 4 areas of vows. Yeah, so there's prayer and contemplation, work and reconciliation, mission and reconciliation, and well-being. Yeah, so these 4 areas which we're never going to arrive at, because it's the idea that we're going to wrestle with these practices around prayer, contemplation, community and mission. Yeah. So that happens every year. So for lots of people, a year is a long, long time. So some communities commit to 5 years that I've heard of, and that's just off the Richter scale. Partly because London, every year 20 to 40% of people move. Yeah. So it's a hugely mobile place. So then you have to try and create some stability in the context of that about dynamic change, yeah. Which is why it's so difficult to do parish churches in the middle of somewhere like London. Yeah.
And so how long has the Blackfriars Community been going?
So it's been going formally for 2 years, and the kind of conversations and the building of it's been going on for 4 years. So it took a little while to come together because of the kind of COVID shock and everything else. Because you can't really think about monasticism when you can't even be in the same room. So, that really knocked us back. I mean, our heart at the beginning was to be part dispersed, part residential. And I really hope, so I'm going to be leaving soon, but I really hope the next rector of the parish and prior of the community will be brave to talk to our patrons, because there is a 4-bedroomed flat that's rented out to raise money for the patrons. It'd be great if that could become a little hub for a residential community. But you have to be super careful with residential community, because I've had experiences of it going... When it works, it's brilliant. When it goes wrong, it's horrible.
Well, yeah, and it takes that extra level of looking after...
And very strict boundaries. Super difficult when because I have experience of one going wrong, and I learnt a lot from that.
Wow, and so... And how many people would you say are currently part of the Blackfriars community?
It's probably about 12 to 14. I mean, it varies a bit, because some people come in, very enthusiastic, very excited. But you have to do the inner work for this type of community. It can't just be external. Because some people get a bit, there's a danger that somehow they make the community their higher power rather than God. So there's a real maturity, and not everybody can do that inner work. It requires a level of commitment. So everybody in the community is expected to have an external spiritual director, and if necessary, a therapist, because you can't do that type of work in a dispersed community. Yeah, you can't really easy to hold that. So when people play out their own psychodrama in community, it can kill community. And so we get quite lots of people who are very enthusiastic. Some people really focus on it, do the work, and it works really well. Sometimes people get to that point where you have to do the inner work, and then doesn't work because they won't face it. And that's a real problem today. I think people are so broken, we carry so many wounds, that the danger is if you bring people too close with that woundedness, you end up hurting people. So we are very strong on facing that and committing to your own spiritual journeying in community. And we try to do things, particularly on Wednesday nights, providing opportunities for support, reading books together in terms of prayer practices, the lot. But not many, I think everybody thinks that new monasticism is going to be the panacea for the future of the church. I don't think so. It never has. Monasticism was always a minority sport. It just always hit above its weight because of the depth. So I don't think that this sort of spiritual community is the answer for everywhere. I do think it can really help, but there's a danger that if you get it wrong, it can really hurt people. So I'm very aware of the need to do that properly. So we did actually have to ask someone to leave recently, who was very angry about quite a lot of things, who I didn't think had the propensity to do the inner work. So that's not going to work, playing out that level of anger in community. Yeah. I do think that's really important. That's what we're trying to do in these sort of missional, intentional communities, is how do you be healthy communities when people aren't playing out their rubbish. And I think one of the reasons why you see so many dysfunctional, unhealthy parish churches is that you don't really have the commitment to do the inner work. Yeah. So therefore people play out all sorts of power games and rotas and all the rest of it gets mixed up into this kind of massive unhealthy psychodrama, which is why I think so many people are put off Christianity, because there's so many dysfunctional forms of church. Well, this is trying to make a contribution to a fragile but intentionally healthy, I hope, small little community to open up the possibility of Christianity.
And some people who haven't heard about community or aren't familiar with community, it can sometimes be alarm bells, like exactly. Is it a cult? Like exactly. Is it really, can't it get really toxic? And
yeah, we live in such an atomized, individualistic society, and I think that's part of the fact that we live in a post-secular. You don't hear too much about that, but I really do believe our culture's moved on from cultural modernity to post-modernity to post-secularization, and we live in a market society that fundamentally dehumanizes people, and I think isolates people. So therefore people don't know how to do community. So there's not a commitment to interpersonal skills. It's all about I, rather than we. And that needs a journey of human becoming. So actually doing intentional community, I would argue, is harder now than it was before. Because people don't have interpersonal skills.
We don't live in large families anymore, or intergenerational families.
And they're used to getting their own way. They're used to consuming rather than sense of collaboration or cooperating. And it's a very different mindset.
And it's interesting, actually, in terms of thinking about people of my generation. Like, you basically everyone's lived in a house share at some point. Yes. So like we're being pushed back into that model, as it were. Yes. But for me, community is preferable to house sharing, because at least you've got a framework in which people are committed to talking about things rather than just passively aggressively like not talking to someone whilst making tea. But as with anything, I think there's a sense in which you can have healthy family, you can have unhealthy family, you can have helpful technology, you can have harmful technology, and community for me falls under that bracket. And it's
but it is harder if you don't have the skills to do it.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And so I think there's a danger. I think that some communities, where they happen as having to live together in houses, become intolerant coexistence rather than really being community.
Yeah, and it's been interesting speaking with some people who live in, community in London, but maybe came out more of two friends or two family friends, or two sets of families coming together and living, and that being a very different approach and style of community, often formulated about like having found a property rather than starting out with what is the vision, what are we feeling called to do.
Couldn't agree with you more. So I wrote a book for me which is incredibly important, which is about thinking about the Trinity as a model of community. So how do we open up that kind of Trinitarian Christian spirituality as a way of life? So I wrote a book called God on Loan after travelling with Moot, exploring these issues for a long time, about that subject. Because I think unless you've got that Trinitarian basis, you don't really understand human community. Because God is modelling oneness in three persons in some sort of dynamic connection. So we are called to live out oneness in the context of being different persons. So, and there's been a lot of argument theologically around social interpretation of the Trinity. I think I'm of the view, drawing on liberation theology and people like Leonardo Boff, that it's really important.
And someone yesterday asked me what was like a key thread of the communities that I've been visiting for the past few months, and the one that always jumps to mind is a genuine pursuit of the Spirit. But on a more practical level, I was also reflecting on it seems to help to have a structure or some kind of leadership of some form, and to have at least one person who's actively like nurturing the community, overseeing it. And I wonder whether you could speak to that.
So in the Society of Trinity, what we looked at we struggled with some of the Benedictine stuff where there classically would be an abbot elected, where that governance worked by a chapter model where everybody would be consulted, but at some point the abbot would make a decision and that's it. And you do by obedience to the abbot. We didn't feel that really could work because there's a danger of that becoming quite culty. So in the Society of the Trinity, we've tried to have, even in small communities, a tripartite leadership with very defined roles. So each of these communities will have a prior, sub-prior and dean. Yeah, so the dean is there for community meetings like chapter meetings of old, where anybody who's made commitments to the community can raise something. And the dean controls the agenda, not the prior or the sub-prior. Yeah. Sub-prior is there really with pastoral support and for those who've made seasonal vows for encouragement and just practical management stuff. And the prior is what we would probably call the leader of leaders, whose responsibility often is to say no, or when things are difficult to ask people to leave, and if there are conflicts to try and sort them out, and to give some sort of encourage the community of strategic direction. So I agree, you do need to have some sort of leadership, but the model has always been by election. And what I'm super aware of, that monasticism throughout the centuries was very concerned about the over-clericalisation of the church. And so we have to be super careful in these new monastic communities. They're not just more clergy doing it all and everybody else just passively following along. So in this community, 2 of the leaders are lay, and that is deliberate. And only 1 is ordained. Yeah. And that's because it's still in a start-up mode. And I hope that in future, like many other new monastic communities, the entire leadership will be lay. Yeah. But it's not strong enough yet to be there yet.
And it's sometimes when reflecting on communities, I've almost been scared of using the word leadership because it has so many negative connotations, because there's so many examples of bad leadership.
Yeah. And because of all the abuse, it still goes on.
Yeah. But maybe a better word is, I've seen like really beautiful holding of communities. But,
you have to have authority.
But there's authority.
It's
not. It's.
I've heard. I think I prefer the language of guardianship. Guardian. That sort of thing works better. Yeah. That's why we used some of the religious language around prior, sub-prior and dean, because those roles are really clear. Yeah. I think the problem about leader is quite a secular word. Yeah.
Feels quite top down.
And the last thing is we want is direct or anything like that. Yeah. So I think you need to have, whatever word language you use, the person needs to have the authority to say no to something. Yeah. Yeah. And if they can't, because they've got to keep negotiating about everything, then it becomes dangerous or unsafe. Yeah. Yeah,
and I guess that's maybe what's harder when community is a bit more informal and a bunch of people getting together, is that there's no one who has the no.
Well, that's why there is a constitution where it's all very, very clear about how things work. Yeah, that sort of. I do think there's this idea that somehow you shouldn't have structures and definitions of things and travel light, as if that's a good thing. I think I struggle with that quite a lot, because for me, the reason why jazz bands can improvise is because the rules are very clear and very structured. So I think you can improvise in life if you've got things sorted out. I mean, yes, there's a danger of institutionalisation, but if everybody understands how things work, then it just makes conflicts, difficulties, challenges, change all that much easier, rather than having to renegotiate it every time, which is exhausting. Yeah, and requires maturity. Yeah, this type of thing. One of the big problems I think is that lots of our society is where people carry on like adult children, where there's not a huge amount of tolerance or love towards each other. This type of community requires people to grow up quite a lot.
I think it's kind of community is a very real way to live, where you are confronted with your own stuff, other people's stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's hard. It can be hard. It was here quite hard recently. Unfortunately, it's not nice having to ask people to leave or to suggest that they leave, but sometimes you have to when you suddenly realise, wait a minute, this has got really difficult, or it's dividing people, or setting up a conflict which you have to ask why, what's going on when that happens. So that kind of community cohesion, harmony is so important.
Yeah, and another overarching reflection I've had is the importance of having, that groundwork which has been set. Like, this is who we are as a community, and this is what we do, and it's the structure on which things then evolve and like naturally grow, and people like add their own skills and ideas to it, and like people prayerfully discern like where it's going. But ultimately, that's very much, and then it means that when people join, they know what they're getting themselves. Their expectations need to be set, don't they?
I think that, yes, exactly. But see, the thing, I think almost some places that people come from have a lot to teach the church as well. So, for example, quite a lot of people who are spiritual seekers have come from 12-step movements and 12-step fellowships, which are very boundaried, that open up spirituality for those in forms of recovery. And it only works because of the structures and the rules that they follow around the 12 steps and 12 traditions. And I think that draws quite heavily on the religious life. Yeah, so these communities work well when those things are really clear and transparent. They don't work so well when that isn't transparent. And the danger then people can play the system, and then it just causes a lot of pain and hurt. I've certainly been in communities like that before. Yeah. So when it works, it can be really powerful. Yeah, that's why I do this.
And so, because I also have a real interest around community and the church and how the two come together, which is exactly what this is and what you seem to do. And also, I'm glad you mentioned about the potential residential community component, because in my head, like, the church has property, and like, don't sell it off. Like, it can be used, and it can house community, which can be a real kind of, can help catalyse things in a community and be a central point and a place of welcome. So what you've done here at Blackfriars, do you think that is a model which can be like spread? Do you have thoughts around how new monasticism might grow, for example, within the Church of England? I also have questions around like the church explicitly hired you, knowing that they needed something different to be done, and like is that a model of church that we need? I also come from a Catholic context where we've got like one priest for 5 churches, and so it's hard to see anything fresh coming out of that if you're overwhelmed with masses and weddings and funerals.
Exactly.
So kind of thoughts around context.
Well, we always remembered that the beginning of Christian monasticism was a response against Christendom, particularly attractional models of church, when they were super concerned that a church had been persecuted with real depth and a real commitment to serving the poor, that something was going to be lost. Yeah. So there's always been this 2 streams in the Christian faith between radical communities and churches of place, parishes, dioceses, attractional models of church. Yeah. So there's always been a healthy tension between the two, I think, that the monastic communities had a prophetic call to hold dioceses, parishes and their clergy and bishops accountable to the depth of the authenticity of the Christian faith. And I think the other way around is that parishes and bishops held accountable communities so they didn't go too super spiritual, slightly off the planet. Yeah. So there's been this 2-way going on between the two for quite some time. And there's always been this interrelationship. We have to remember, because I'm coming from an Anglican context, that when Henry VIII kicked out the monastics and the mendicants, mission went out the window for a very long time. And we forget that this poor just starved to death. It's huge. Yeah, so I tend to think of Henry VIII as an absolute tyrant. And remember that the religious communities were only put back into the Church of England in the time of the Industrial Revolution crisis, when largely Benedictine and Franciscan communities were put back into the church as part of the Oxford movement and the Catholic renewal of the Church of England, which is what I identify
Catholic
with quite a lot.
of the Church of England,
which is strongly there. Yeah, yeah. So there's a recovery of that, where before it had been quite Presbyterian. So the Church of England is exploring this idea of in a context where we can't do parish churches like we used to, where it was all about attraction or come to us. And if you want things like baptism, confirmation and other things, then you're forced to have a relationship with us. That doesn't really exist anymore now. So we have to move from that kind of attractional pastoral mode to getting back to that more apostolic calling about being sent, about that sentness into context. And that's something I think that monastics and mendicants just get by the DNA of what it's about, which parish churches are really struggling with. So there is a crisis, and I think in all traditions of church, that seems to be turning more to the influence of secular management and management approaches to managing decline and influence and risk assessments and all the rest of it, rather than the inspiration of what is Christian community. And I think they look down on, I think it's a negativity towards Christian community as something bordering on a cult, unnecessary and weird people. Yeah. So, I mean, some of that is also true in some contexts, but that stereotype doesn't help. Yeah. So I think there is that. I think the question then is, how in a parish context, how can we bring these two things together, these two streams about being something that's attractional, that's open door, that anybody can walk in and participate in without applying managerialism too much? And how do we then draw on forms of the religious life to have a depth of discipleship, depth of spirituality? And so I think this idea of a mixed ecology is a really helpful one, where because our society is so splintered and we can't just do a service that relates to everybody, because how many, here there's about 45 different languages spoken in a very small amount of space, different worldviews, different ages, different ethnicities. It is impossible, the idea, to have a service and think that the parish is going to turn up in some sense of coherence. It ain't going to happen. So we have to do lots of little things for lots of different groups of people, and then try to work out what can we do that might transcend those difficulties to help people. So I'm quite committed to thinking about how forms of new monasticism, and that term, by the way, is not very helpful. I find it very difficult, but it's got stuck. But that is the word that people use inside the church. Yeah, it sounds very Christian-y. I mean, proper religion, Benedict and Francis hate it because they hear it as monastic light. But I think it is a calling to be a Christian in the context of a rhythm of life with spiritual practices as a particular way of understanding Christian discipleship. So I think bringing those two together can be really helpful. Like, here's a good example. We have a Sunday morning congregation of largely people who live in the area, largely families with kids and a few older people, and that totally disconnect from anybody else. So by having a little new monastic community here, largely in their 20s to 50s, that somehow where they're starting to explore the Christian faith in some detail in terms of worship, mission and community, that somehow that then creates a depth and authenticity and even social capital to be able to do something. Yeah, so I do think that mixed ecology, that missional mixed ecology becomes a really key thing. And I suppose the other thing we haven't said, I think now more than ever that there is a big resonance between post-secular spirituality and the contemplative Christian tradition. Yeah, so we draw heavily on the contemplative Christian traditions largely of Catholic orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, and some of the more reformed traditions of Christianity, drawing on them and the mystics and all the rest of it as a resource for our own practice, but also to live this out in the context of being more missional in the world. Because some of that stuff really speaks to people,
And there's something about the social capital of community, and I think something about a critical mass as well.
Yes.
So you're thinking about there's only so much you can do about like homelessness as an individual, but as a community, and churches are good at that. So I think that's something where parishes can really focus efforts.
When they can be bothered to, yes.
Yeah.
When it's not just about them. That's the danger. It all is ever about them. A real, proper, mature parish, yes. I agree. It can be incredibly transformative when it does really think of the people on their patch. I've seen powerful examples of urban community which do just that, and they're concerned about the people. I like that expression, people on their patch, and exist for the people on their patch and know their patch and are open and it helps to be in community and to have that critical mass and in a way that you can't on an individual basis, and
So I find community very powerful for...
I really wish that everybody was forced to go to Teze or some sort
I
of
still haven't
ecumenical
been
or
yet.
Bose or somewhere like that, because I think once you see it and taste it, you want it, you know. So I had that before I was a Christian, and that's always been with me, because the amount, you know, that I was very touched. And I love the way that people come to things like the Teze thing we did on Sunday, very touched, you know, and I hope that this little community can make a greater impact on those who walk past these doors, and they're thousands every day, but don't walk in because they think it's not for them. Yeah. So, yeah.
And I've got more questions on the bigger picture stuff, but wondering whether you could maybe share what a week at the Blackfriars Community looks like.
So thinking about Sunday, so Sunday evenings every week there is a contemplative form of service, and with that sense of community and socialising. So one of those is a contemplative Eucharist, which is chant-based. One of those is the Teze service, which is very chant-based. One of them is a Compline service, and the other one is one that we got permission for, which was rewriting an Anglican service of the word, which all sounds very boring, but actually then is about how can we have a type of service that's focused on using a particular Franciscan, Benedictine or Ignatian prayer practice as a form of worship service. So that's on Sunday evenings.
On rotation, the different types of service?
Yes, so there's one every month, yeah. And hopefully at some point, because all the gardens are outside here are going to be redeveloped, we want to do some labyrinth type services as well. Which gets back to the heart of pilgrimage, yeah. So it's some of that about journeying to God, which is the heart of what contemplation is all about. So that's Sundays. We used to do morning and evening prayer on Mondays, but we've realised with lockdown that most of the business here are mostly here Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So the business community are absent. So we thought, right, we're going to change what we do to put greater emphasis on Tuesday. So now there's nothing happening on Mondays except for some online things. Tuesday morning there is meditation group for those before work, followed by...
It's like 7 to 8?
That's, what time is that? 7:30 till 8. And then there's morning prayer from 8 to 8:30 normally. And then the community, there's whoever's around, there's a little bit of a community thing. And then there's evening prayer on Tuesdays as well, for those after work. Wednesdays evening, we have a lot of stuff. So Wednesday evening there is, again, a meditation, followed by evening prayer, and then the community gather for some sort of formational thing. And that's either, so at the moment we're reading a good friend of mine's kind of a Polish new monastic in the States, Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide is the book we're reading together at the moment. Before that we read St. John of the Cross, and so it's trying to open up some of these really, and then before that Thomas Merton. So lots of that stuff, and that's Wednesday evenings, and that can be pastoral, prayer practices, the lot, yeah, trying to promote that group. Then Thursday we do an online compline. Saturdays is sometimes morning prayer, and that's the rhythm, yeah. There's a mixture of in-person and online, yeah. And I suppose what we're trying to do here is, you know, in the same way that we haven't really talked about spaces of belonging, which I think is another big innovation, is about how do you waymark, how do you help people to waymark from shifting from being kind of almost like spiritual tourists to becoming co-travelling Christians. And that takes a journey, yeah, which starts off with breaking down negative stereotypes about Christianity in the church, to then try out these spiritual practices before you're Christian, really, and then to open up the pathway towards God. And so, inspired by the fact that you have these same spaces of belonging in traditional communities, which normally have things like aspirant, simple profession, you know, life profession. You have these stages of that. So we thought, okay, what would that look like if we use these different stages of very clear different commitments to waymark the place from being spiritual seekers to becoming co-travelling core Christians who run this, you know, at the heart of this community. So that's what we've done. So the people you experienced at that service last night were a mixture of people coming from all those different spaces. Yeah.
And is there... because I've talked to communities thinking about similar things, but maybe fearing a sense of hierarchy, which comes with that.
No. I think it's more, no, I don't think it's about hierarchy. It's more about authenticity
But
and
like
depth.
a fear of it being perceived.
Yes. Well, I think that's where you have to be really clear what it's about.
Yeah, because it was the Birmingham Urban Community where they commissioned the community, but then the parishioners who were at the commissioning were like, so they've had to deal with the tension of how is it that we hold this community without the parishioners feeling like this community are an unwanted spiritual elite or something.
Well, that could be the difficulty with our Sunday morning congregation. You see, that somehow I privilege this. Yeah. Well, then, in a sense, that goes back to the earlier thing we talked about, how the Sunday morning congregation don't have a calling to live that way, and that's okay. Yes, but they also need to give room for this thing to exercise its ministry in the context of. So there's something about vocations, not about power and hierarchy. Yeah. So if we give room for vocations, so I, as a rector of this church, deliberately don't do the hierarchical thing, but much more of a nurture thing. I mean, I still have to be boundaried and make difficult decisions, but I do that in a different way. So, and I think that lots of people struggle with that when I first came here, because I don't play out, oh, he's the vicar, you don't question, and you're on a pedestal. No. So we all are ordinary priests. Some of us are called to be ordained. So that's a service, not a power over people. Yeah. Very powerful, that. So I think that's what monasticism can do, if it's done well, that we get back to, this is about various different types of promises, different stages of faith. This is not about, the chapter at the heart of this community should not be the place with all the power. Yeah. How does everybody have a voice in decision-making processes? Yeah. So it's messy.
Community.
It's not neat and tidy. It certainly doesn't reflect. My greatest challenge, I want this to be at the heart of this church, because what I'm frightened of is I see churches' business too much in lots of other places, where they run to the orientation and the DNA of a business. So the priest becomes a managing director, the PCC become the board of trustees, and the people who work for it become staff. And it loses that idea of being ecclesia as the radical community to live out the values of the kingdom of God. And I'm like, no, church's business for me is idolatry. So I resist that. I'm not trying to say we don't manage our resources carefully, because we do it properly here, but that is not that is not the heart of what we're about. The DNA has to be about the kingdom of God. And if we lose that, then forget it. And that's why Christian community is so important.
Yeah. And given that you've got so much experience in kind of pioneering community, maybe would you be able to summarise how it is that you kind of help nurture the Blackfriars community from you kind of coming here to where it's at now?
Well, some of this relates to, it's been the parallel thing for me was the Fresh Expressions movement, which is an ecumenical movement now, which is great. And that's very much about and the vision of that is, how do we build ecclesial community out of contextual mission? Yeah. And that's getting back to what the mendicants were all about.
And how would you define ecclesial for people who don't?
So I would say ecclesial community is a sense of something that is on a journey to, a little bit what I said earlier about how do we live out the sense of a community in terms of worship, mission and community and faithfulness to Christ, living out some of the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount and the rest. Yeah. So I think there's a methodology that really works really well. So it's about listening. Yeah, so you listen to context, and then you try to engage in some form of loving service, and you're looking for other people who feel called to be in community in that. But the loving service is often to people who are de-churched, unchurched, and the rest. Yeah, so, and you try lots of different things, like meditation groups for stressed up people. It might not have worked, yeah, or lots of other things. But some things will work, and there's a connection made. And then that then leads to a process, I think, because I think God is in the business of building ecclesial community, that listening, loving service, people then start committing to being part of community. And I think when they feel safe, start asking religious questions. Yeah, but it takes a long time for people to learn to trust Christians and church for that process to begin. And then when people start asking those religious questions, what we try to do here is open up contemplative resources to help people with their questions. So it's not about sending people on courses but actually we try to open it up in life that then helps people to then either become Christian or to return to Christianity. And then ecclesial community and the marks of the church are built.
And the gift of being able to talk about faith with people that you trust, and potentially people who are very different to you as well.
Yes.
And how that's something.
But that requires, but there's a real model of mission here that the church misses out. And I think the problem in all our traditions, that mission has been about, almost trying to force people to explore Christianity for a certain amount of coercion, or try to get them on a course or a meal or alpha and all the rest of it, which I think then is coercive, because mission is ultimately about God unsettling people to journey towards God. Yeah. So I'm really into this more contemplative model of mission, which basically says it's God's mission, is not ours, so we need to get out of the way. So our role then is to curate opportunities and wait for people to ask questions in their time and on the language. Yeah. So we make a real point of not forcing Christianity down anybody's throat. So for the meditation group, it doesn't talk about Christianity at all. It opens up a Christian prayer practice and it says that we are Christian and leaves it at that. And it waits for people to ask religious questions, and that may take 2 or 3 years. Yeah. So that's about then giving room, and then people are so unused to Christians letting go of power, letting go of trying to make something, force people to be, and all the rest of it. And there's a certain amount of shock that goes with that. So some of the people you met who were there last night were people who have been spiritual seekers for quite some time and are just starting to commit to coming to more Christian-y type things. So that therefore is this model of curation, which I think is so helpful, where it's much more incarnational in its theology than redemptive. We must tell everybody they're sinners. We must tell them they're converted from the sin. Pressure, shame, the rest. This says, no, the love of God is what's driving all of this, and people are being unsettled to the source of all life. Yeah. So I love that model of mission as God's restoring all things back into right relationship. So we are called to live that and breathe that, and to create opportunities and to really listen to what's going on and what people's needs are, but not trying to say, we need to get you on some sort of conversion course. I can't bear it.
Good community, I think, really embodies something of God in a way that words can't be put to, but that people can feel.
Well, that's what happened with me.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think Iona's that place for a lot of people.
Exactly.
And for me, it was my experience of community was like, there is something very powerful here. Yeah.
How can we open that up to more people?
Exactly.
So having high street or having these things going on in more accessible places is what this is all about. And I think what people forget, in all, Catholic and Anglican, this country started off with lots of religious communities, that multiplied. The parish system came out of religious communities, whether a Benedictine, Franciscan nation or the rest of it. But it grew out of mother houses. Yeah. And so we have to remember the whole parish system didn't just come out of the air. It came from Benedictines planting all sorts of new communities that became parish churches. Yeah. And it's really interesting now that what is it going to take to revitalise the parish systems of our different denominations? No surprise, it's religious life again. It's the powerhouse that can restore those things to get back to that depth. Yeah. So yeah, but there are some things. It's not for everyone. It's certainly not short term. It takes years to do this thing. The fruit is incredibly slow, and it costs a lot. People's time, depth, resources. It's not cheap.
Yeah.
And it's costly.
Yeah, and I was talking with someone about this, and we came up with the phrase of what desires impact kills impact, in reference to, like, 3-year funding plan. If you give us this money in 3 years' time, this many people will be transformed. And measuring things and like metrics, like what's the impact been, and feel like
it's a real problem.
And like, where's God in this? Like, God knows.
Well, exactly.
And
are you thinking particularly about SDF bids and things? Are you thinking Anglican or other
just
things?
in general?
Just in general,
and also like just in the
well,
charity
that's a short-term,
sector.
it's managerialism, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's the world that we live in when it comes to applying to money and things. But then I guess it's how is it that, so this church seemed to believe there's something, wanted inspiration, and is that?
Well, I think they were so desperate. Well, what was quite good about here is there was a medieval charity behind the place that a baker on London Bridge set up in the 16th century. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist here because there was not enough resources to bring something back to life. But the patrons were so desperate, the archdeacon was so desperate, and they'd seen what I'd done in other places that I was invited to come and do that here. They had and I think if they were not desperate, this would not have happened. So there's a certain amount of desperation that creates opportunity.
And I guess it's how is it that we can inspire churches to be thinking in different ways. So for example, even when it comes to property, someone was telling me that a monastery in London had sold part of their monastery. It's like, what? Like selling part of your property in London. And yes, it would be work to invite lay people to live alongside that monastic community, but it would potentially, if it works, it would be beautiful.
Yeah, and that's where I think the Roman Catholic Church has done quite a lot of good in Europe, in the sense that it forces old communities not just to spend their money on remembering what was, but where they're coming to the end of their life, they make I've seen this happen a few times now, they make connections with new religious communities, and those new religious communities are asked to share the resources, and they have to take responsibility for the nuns and monks and friars who need looking after into old age. But the resources that are then passed on to new
I'd love examples
communities.
Of that.
Chemin Neuf is a really big one.
Yeah.
So communities in England and France is a really good example. There's loads of Chemin Neuf communities that have done that.
Alongside traditional monastic.
So something starts off as I'm thinking of a Carmelite community. That's exactly what's happened quite a few times. So they've got a number of monasteries and convents and religious houses because of this gifting between the new and the old. And what upsets me in Anglicanism is that some extremely wealthy religious communities decided to spend their money on creating museums of what was, while lots of new religious communities have absolutely no resources to get going with. That is wrong, but that's what's happened in the Church of England.
With the end, it's been Hillfield Friary.
Yeah, that was a good. Hillfield's a very good example of knowing a very rich landlord. Who gave you land in his very rich estates. Yeah. So there are models. I mean, it's almost like
the traditional monastic and the
exactly.
monastic,
So they've got a house there, which they're experimented with. Yeah, totally.
But that is the thing with community is when if it's dispersed, it's dispersed. But the residential community does need stable property, really.
It does, and stable finances. Yeah. So that's why somewhere like here has the stability to do that now. Didn't before. But yeah, very lucky to have patrons here, which most parishes don't have that sort of generous basis here. So that's why I think it all, it's almost like a neo-medievalism where you've got some rich patron behind a religious community, or something that creates some stability, or that you create that. So when I was in the City of London, we ran a very successful cafe, and that created the income that you plough into the community to sustain it. Yeah, so but that requires a real focus, a way of life. And the problem is, I think so many people are so very short term, and with a real impoverishment of real Christianity, this stuff is not easy. So that's why I think contemplation is a natural home and a place to start from, because lots of people are really hungry for forms of contemplative prayer. So instead of running contemplative prayer groups in parishes of different traditions, what would that look like if it was a new monastic community where contemplation was part of that calling, not all of it?
And the urban I don't know whether you've heard of Hodge Hill in Birmingham.
I have.
Yeah,
yes.
And they do a lot because they don't have their own church building. The groups happen in these homes, which I think does make it more accessible.
Some people won't go to people's homes though. That's why we've worked out. No. If you're truly going to do things for unchurched people, it's got to be in neutral spaces.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah, I guess home, well, yeah, it depends who you are, isn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Whether it feels like a neutral space or
It's
not.
interesting in my experience, is it for people, I hate using social economic groupings, but for those kind of more working class type people, going to people's houses is really uncomfortable. Yeah. Eating with other people is really uncomfortable. Yeah. It's quite a middle classy thing to do. Yeah. So that's why I think we have to get back, okay, so how can we utilise our buildings to be more hubs, and what can we do to, so for example, when I came here, it was horrible here. The whole building felt about 1950s. It was drab, it was totally unspiritual. So we spent a lot of time repainting it, doing it all up. That's why it's not a bad space in there now. That's why you're getting a new triptych on the wall that's up there at the moment. So it's all, so how do we put the spirituality back in our buildings, and how do we make them usable spaces for everybody, not just for Christians to gather around worship. So, and that's where they started. If you look at the churches in the early Roman Empire, there was everything going on in them, not just worship services. So anyway, so we have to get back to that being rooted, thing, rather than thinking if you're going to do community somehow you have to be withdrawn or away. I think at heart I'm much more of a mendicant, than a monastic. Yeah. So I couldn't go and, like the Northumbria community, go up there, and they've got a lovely community, it's amazing, and they do some amazing dispersed stuff, but I feel called to be in the world where the church is weak, not to be in places of abandon, that's a monastic calling. So I'm much more of this mendicant.
And that's what my journeys have emphasised to me as well, is the wanting to be in the places, but whilst acknowledging the importance of the work that people do in those remote spaces. Yes. I think also it's a where you're at in life type of thing as well, and what you need. Yes. But yeah.
And I love the fact that you've got new monastic communities that are Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, and other Reformed churches, so that says something.
Yeah, and I found ecumenical community very powerful. For the exploration of questions in a way that I didn't feel I could do so freely in a mono-denominational context.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, and what are you off to do in Canada?
So basically I was offered a job I couldn't refuse, really, because I've done a bit, because of the new monasticism stuff, and because at times I've had to raise money for projects by writing and speaking, which I used to call my lecture prostitution doors. Which literally was that. I built up a relationship with quite a number of different countries in different contexts. So I was made a connection with the Diocese of Niagara, and originally through the Diocese of Toronto, where the person there was a diocesan missionary and got me out there to do some work on trying to develop fresh expressions of church and new monastic communities. And so she's now the Bishop of Niagara, and she invited me to become what's called a diocesan missioner. So very much thinking about where the church is weak, thinking about what communities could be set up where the church is miles away, to try and do that, and particularly thinking about new monasticism. So I've been in London for a long time now, and I've got to 55, so I think I need to get out, really. And there were no opportunities. I was really keen to move into France and Europe to do new monasticism, and there's not been any opportunity. So the only open door was Canada. So we're going to go and do that for a while. And so there I will be involved in hopefully setting up a new monastic community within a cathedral context, and looking at trying to support some new missional startups in failed parishes where there's buildings and things that still could be used, and trying to discern and train people who are called to do that sort of work in a really progressive diocese, which super excites me. So yeah, it feels like the right next step to do that and be part of the Society of Holy Trinity, but in Canada.
And in your vast experience of kind of setting up these new monastic communities, what wisdom would you want to share from these experiences?
Big question. I think the journey in this starts with the painful journey of being unsettled by God to want to do more, or to desire more, or that sense that the way that church is somehow not feeding you. Yeah. So when that happens, I think it's worth exploring what is it that God is calling you to become. And I think that there's something about prayer and a deeper sense of prayer, this more contemplative path, combined with a desire to live a sustainable way of life in all that's problem with the world at the moment, that is, by definition, new religious communities. Look for people who really want to do this and have walked before you. And it's badly needed now, because unfortunately what tends to happen is that people like that then leave the church, give up on Christianity, explore alternative spirituality. And I suppose I'd want to say, please notice the richness of the traditions, your Teresa of Avila's, your Thomas Merton's, your St John of the Cross, the list is endless, that people don't know about. So one of the pieces of work we did was running spiritual, not religious dialogue groups, which is something I really believe in. They were shocked to find out there's a contemplative tradition within Christianity. They assumed Christianity was all fundamentalism in the head. And I thought, gosh, how sad is that? So yes, for Christians, we need people to be called out to live this way. Look for people who can partner with you to help you on your journey. And expect it not to be easy. Your Benedicts, your Francis, they never had easy times. There's the ministry of not quite fitting in. Yeah. And I've got used to that now, so I don't worry about it anymore. And that's okay. Seen as kind of a maverick or a not quite kosher, or a troublemaker in some respects. So someone who refuses to give up on this. So yeah, but there's a lot of us now, different traditions around the place. And one of the great things I love every other year, there is a gathering of European new monastic communities in Switzerland as a mixture of different communities. So some members of this community will be going to that, and I spoke at it 2 years ago,
What's
and
the
that
name
was a
of
joy. It's called the New Monastic Round Table, and that is a gathering of charismatic evangelical Christians, liberal Catholics, of different denominations in lots of different European countries.
And what would you class as new monastics? In visiting different communities, I would call something like Chemin-Neuf new monastic, and I'd call this new monastic.
Yes.
Places like Pilsden, I maybe call intentional Christian community.
Yes.
Iona maybe would come under the new monastic area. But for me, the new monastic element is maybe to do with rhythms of prayer being quite a core component, which isn't necessarily a core component.
And being mission focused, and either renewal or mission focused. Where I think some communities are communities for the existence of being community, and that's okay. Yeah.
Which kind of communities would you put in that category?
So I would definitely say, well, Taizé wouldn't agree with me, but I think Taizé is a new monastic community. I think they have to be very contemplative, very focused on mission, drawing on a Benedictine and Franciscan and Ignatian basis often, so that monastic and mendicant tradition, and having possibly a closer relationship with dioceses and parishes than traditional communities.
And therefore, would this gathering be appropriate for intentional Christian communities of the likes of Pilsden, Windsor Wood, who are very mission-focused and
different type of mission, though, isn't it? Yeah. So I think so some of these communities, I'm thinking of the ones in Germany and Switzerland, were people who were given up on church and wanted to live out Christian communities which were deeply missional, combined with more your diocesan parish-based stuff going on here. Yeah. So Iona's not there. Pilsner's community is not there. Northumbria community is there. I think there's not always black and white, is it? But I think for me, I think to be new monastic, there have to be missional, contemplative, have rhythms of life with seasonal vows, seeking to be in the world predominantly, many of them urban, but not all. And then something about that, think about a real commitment to trying to enable people to move from being unchurched spiritual seekers to becoming Christians. I think that is the particularity around new monasticism. And I see that's the same in Canada, the United States, and in Europe, which is different to Iona, different to Pilsner. And it's not trying to say they don't have legitimate, because they really do.
They're still Christian community. They're
exactly. There's all sorts of different types of community. You know what I mean? So some of them are. But as I say, the term isn't great. It tends to upset everybody. It just has got stuck.
Yeah, and you've mentioned, well, it sounds like you've written some things or lectured on some things. Are there any resources which would, if people have enjoyed this conversation, where should they go? I
deliberately wrote a book a very long time ago now, getting old, with someone who was very involved in a different type of new monasticism than me, and very, and a lay person when I was ordained. So we wrote a book called The New Monastic Handbook, which is a book written to try and help people who really felt called to form new monastic communities. So that's one. I wrote a book on the Trinity and that how to open up Trinitans, just digging deeper with Trinitarian Christian spirituality, drawing a lot more on Orthodox theology to try and understand why the Trinity is so important in terms of our spiritual practices. And then I have been involved in the Fresh Expressions movement in this UK, so there's quite a lot of books written by pioneers in different areas, which is this book series called Ancient Faith, Future Mission. And the book I'm writing at the moment, which will come out next year, is I've just finished a PhD, which I'm quite pleased about, which started off about looking at the spirituality of the spiritual, not religious, and has ended up coming up with a whole model of mission based on contemplation. And that'll be written up next year. Yeah, thinking about and I think there's something particular about new monastic communities and those who are more contemplative, to draw on this model of the way of thinking about doing mission, which I'm quite excited about, because it's not all this redemptive stuff that I find quite difficult.
And do you feel like it's a connected enough scene? Because I've been on this journey, this is the kind of work which is really kind of pulling at my heart, and I've met people thanks to my travels, but otherwise it doesn't feel very
I tried very hard. So what we did do, the Archbishop of Canterbury, when he first started, hosted a biannual gathering, which then I tried to gather leaders of new monastic, of different traditions in the United Kingdom to come together. And that was largely Roman Catholic, Methodist, Anglican. And that was great. The pandemic killed that off, and it hasn't really got going again. So that's why I was like, okay, something like there isn't huge amounts of connections. I think there were, and it was starting to get better, but then I think the pandemic killed a lot off. And so we're almost like starting again, trying to build some of these connections. And that's why I think, okay, I'm really pleased that they've started this one in Switzerland. I think this is the third one that they've organised this August. So that's kicking off. And that's important. And I think the gatherings that used to happen here have somewhat died, which is a shame.
Yeah. And Love Bristol are thinking of maybe organising a Christian community conference.
Right.
And I've also got a database of all the Christian communities, not focusing on new monastic, but intentional Christian communities in the UK. I'd be interested in having your eyes review and add any which I've missed.
Okay.
My idea is to hopefully publish that to a website form, and so that people can start looking and finding and connecting.
And how to be really clear about what people mean by intentional Christian community, because it means so different things to different people. Yeah. And then people could be talking very different vocations, I think.
Yeah. And so in my mind, there are different categories of community, which I've kind of vaguely come up with in my head just in visiting them all. But hoping that because there currently isn't a directory of lay UK Christian communities in the UK, other than what is already hosted on Diggers and Dreamers, but it's not very comprehensive. So I might come back to you.
Yeah, do. And then the one good thing is that I can only really speak with any knowledge of what Anglican have tried to do. There is this thing called the Advisory Council of Religious Communities and diocesan bishops that holds a directory of all acknowledged religious communities in the Church of England. So that is one thing I do know about. And there is within Anglicanism this thing called Anglican Religious Communities, which is a separate charity coming out of the Oxford movement that happened in the 19th century.
Is that traditional?
Well, that's traditional and experimental together.
Interesting.
So those are the only... In terms of ecumenical, I'm really quite sad that a lot of that died, that sort of collaboration. Quite a lot of communities, I think, did really suffer in the pandemic, and numbers of them collapsed. Some of the newer ones. although people thought this is too hard and we're moving on.
Yeah, it's hard if you don't have the land or the property as well. Yeah. Or the,
Exactly.
Or the pay. Well, that's another question I have is, to be sustainable, does a community need to have a paid member? That's just a very practical question.
It depends on the context.
Yeah.
Really, but it can work as a collaboration of lay people giving up their time.
Which is the community
if they've got the time and inclination to do that.
And
but it's not easy.
The community that I was a part in Cambridge, it celebrated its 10th anniversary this summer, and it's completely volunteer-led. We don't have our own property, but because of arrangements, we've got some stability and we rent out. But the steering group, which are equivalent to the trustees, are reaching a certain age, and it's unclear how it is going to age. And because it's a really nice dispersed leadership model, it's not like you can just... the best way is if that trustee board just naturally evolves, which is how you'd hope it would work. But Cambridge is... The youth of Cambridge is so transient that it's hard to...
Even more transient and as technology moves on, it becomes even harder, I think, when everybody's like doing dispersed. Yeah.
Whilst if there were like 3 paid positions, for example, then you can hire in...
It makes a big difference. Or that somehow it income generates so you can do that.
Yeah.
Is the other way of doing it. But yeah, you're right, it's not easy.
Yeah.
And I think how you create this stability in the chaos that there is really difficult, you know? Yeah. So, yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. And final question. I've called this podcast Dwelling Place, based on Psalm 84. And I've been asking people where is it they felt God dwelling particularly significantly in the community.
Wow, that's a big question. I think I've got 3 things I'd want to say there. There's something really beautiful to be able to be in a community that can do 20 minutes of silence or 30 minutes of silence and just resting in God. And I have found that very powerful here. The other one I think is about conversation, that there is a deep dwelling of God in the hunger of people and the desire for God in people. So there's a real privilege of hearing those stories that I really love. And the other one is this book reading group that we do now and again. The insights and, just that sense of God being before people and God speaking through the conversations sometimes is overwhelmingly beautiful and connecting. So, there's a lot of dwelling here, Christ's presence in these different things that, this is why doing these new intentional communities for me is so life-giving, because I couldn't do mission stuff without this, really, because it transforms me apart from anybody else. So I think that's it really for me. Those 3 things are deeply about the dwelling of God, even in all the chaos and the brokenness and almost economic slavery of our times, that there is God at work seeking to draw people to spiritual freedom.
Wow, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation.